In all of my videos, I note that there are edge cases and niche situations we could explore. Today we're diving into one of those situations. The difference between hexproof, ward, shroud and effects that use the word choose is one that can be very frustrating to a lot of players when it catches them off guard. It may not be super common, but it can feel very bad if you're caught by surprise. So let's kick things off by explaining what each keyword means. Ward is a triggered ability. It triggers when your permanent becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls. On the ward triggers resolution, the opponent either pays the cost or their spell or ability gets countered. When they target your creature, ward triggers and goes on the stack above their spell. The ward trigger resolves first. If they pay, their spell stays. If not, their spell gets countered. Ward costs can be mana, life, discarding, even sacrificing. How is this different from hexproof? Hexproof is a static ability that prevents targeting in the first place. A player or permanent with hexproof simply cannot be the target of spells or abilities their opponents control. If an effect like Heroic Intervention gives a permanent hexproof in response to a spell that targets it, then that permanent becomes an illegal target when the spell targeting it resolves. Shroud is like hexproof, with one important exception. Hexproof prevents your permanents from being the target of spells or abilities your opponents control, but allows you to target them. This means you can still enchant them, equip them, and target them with your own spells. Shroud prevents this. A permanent with Shroud cannot be the target of any spell or ability, yours included. The one thing that Hexproof, Shroud and Ward all have in common is that they care about the word target in different ways. Just as an effect that uses the word each or all gets around them, the word choose allows one of your opponents to select a permanent you control, even if it's protected by Hexproof, Shroud or Ward. We've already gone over how spells like Soul Shatter, Damnation, and Toxic Deluge get around these effects because they don't target. The word choose is right at home here. It doesn't say the word target, and so effects that prevent targeting are irrelevant here. I fully appreciate how it sounds like angle shooting to say, I can choose your enchantment with Druid of Purification, even though it has hexproof. But the fact of the matter is that hexproof protects against targeting, and the way that the designers chose to make the game is that an effect that says choose gets around that because it's not the word target. Please don't shoot the messenger here. Suppose I have some really powerful creatures, artifacts and enchantments in play, and I've stocked my deck to the brim with different protection effects to make sure my board is difficult to interact with. For the sake of the example, we'll assume that all of my permanents have hexproof, shroud, and protection from all colours. This is quite a fortress, but it's not impenetrable. Let's look at what happens if one of my opponents plays a Druid of Purification. Let's start by working through how the timing works here. The Druids enters the battlefield trigger. Going onto the stack is when everyone gets their chance to respond before it starts to resolve. No choices are made while the trigger is on the stack. That happens when it resolves. Once each player passes priority and agrees to resolve the trigger, then we make the choices in player order and the destruction happens simultaneously as part of the trigger's resolution. It's critical to note that there is no window in which you can respond to the choices once you start resolving the ability. So zooming back out and looking at what happens to me, I feel pretty darn safe with the Druid's trigger on the stack because of all the targeted protection on my board. But this feeling of safety is mistaken, and that's because none of the effects I have on board protect me from effects that say choose instead of target. If you take just one thing from this video, let it be this. Choosing is not targeting. The difference in wording makes an exceptionally critical difference. That means that Hexproof, Ward and Shroud don't protect my things. But what about protection from all colours? Go back to my video on how protection works for a full deep dive into it. But let's check Druid of Purification against what protection keeps my permanent safe from. We'll use the DET acronym to go through our checklist. The Druid isn't damaging anything. It's a destroy effect, and protection doesn't protect against destroy effects. It's not enchanting, equipping or blocking, so none of those apply. And we've already covered that Druid isn't targeting, so having protection from all colours won't help either. It's not completely hopeless though. Let's suppose we rewind to the moment that the ability is on the stack. I know I'm in trouble and will be on the receiving end of it. So when I get priority, I play a heroic intervention to give everything indestructible. We've already covered that the hexproof part is irrelevant here. But indestructible is what will protect my board, because the druid's effect is a destroy effect. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the difference between choosing and targeting can be tricky and counterintuitive. It's also relatively niche, but cards like Druid of Purification are worth noting as examples. Let's look at a couple of other examples that move from the most to potentially least intuitive, depending on how familiar you are with the difference between choosing and targeting. If I have a single creature in play that has hexproof, which means it can't be the target of spells or abilities my opponents control, then my opponent's damnation still destroys it. It's an all effect. No controversy there. Now let's suppose that instead of damnation, they cast a soul shatter. Again, there's still no targeting involved. It's an each effect, so I'm still forced to sacrifice my creature when it resolves. Now here's where I've seen things get controversial in games. Suppose my opponent plays Make an Example. When the spell resolves, each of their opponents separates the creatures they control into 2 piles. Then for each opponent, they choose one of their piles, and the opponents sacrifice the creatures in their chosen pile. When this spell resolves, it makes me create 2 piles, one that's empty and the other that has my hexproof creature in it. Can my opponent choose the pile that my hexproof creature is in? Absolutely. There's no targeting effect involved in this spell, so this is completely legal, and a great way to get around hexproof Shroud and Ward. Another card that fits into this category is Council's Judgment. Players vote on non-land permanents you don't control. You effectively choose via voting, and the chosen permanents get exiled without ever targeting. So hexproof, Ward and Shroud don't help. And like we saw with Druid of Purification, there's no window in which you can respond once the spell resolves and the voting begins. The voting and exiling of the chosen permanents all happen simultaneously as part of the spell's resolution. What this means is that if you wanted to play a Slip Out the Back, or Teferi's Protection, to phase out key permanents, you'd need to do it while the Council's Judgment is on the stack. If everyone passes priority and lets it resolve, then you've lost your window. To sum it all up, look for the word target when trying to determine if hexproof, Shroud, Protection, or Ward can save you from an effect. If you're not sure, ask your table about whether a spell targets, or if it's doing something else like choosing or affecting everything without targeting anything in specific. I've done a couple of videos on hexproof, Shroud, and Ward, and a long one on protecting your board against different kinds of removal effects. Go check those out if you want a deeper look into those mechanics. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.